professor of physics at the University of California and founder of Genescient. And he's here to speak to us today on increasing human longevity. So please give a warm welcome to Gregory Benford.
Well, thank you. And here's our first product. I'll get to that. Well, that's just a lawyer thing up there. The hell with it. About 10 years ago, a television reporter asked a woman he was interviewing, who was 104 years old, what's the best thing about being 104 years old? And she hesitated for a moment and then said very, very clearly, no peer pressure. The goal of my company, Genescient, is to make that little joke obsolete. And this is, right. And this is how we're going to do it. But let me tell you a little background about living longer. I looked up all these demographics, that this is the survival curve, percentage versus time. It goes out, by the way, to 160. But notice in prehistory, you were lucky if you got to 20. At the time of Christ, the mean lifespan is estimated to be about 30. So when Jesus died on the cross, he was actually just slightly beyond the mean at 32. Look at British India in the 1920s. A steep curve, because at the same time in Mexico, you live longer because you were living close to the United States and modern medicine had started to move in. England in the 60s started to approach the asymptote that I indicate in the dashed line, which is roughly the best you can do at the moment. Of course, the world's record is a French woman who sold pencils to Van Gogh and lived to 122. That's the known record. Our goal is to maybe get to 160 or beyond, maybe by 2100, but frankly, I want it next week. And that's the reason I've put several $1 million into this company. I also downloaded this data and graphed it. This is the increase in lifespan in years, of course, versus time in the United States for the 20th century. Notice the big effect of the Spanish influenza. And notice that you see a bunch of oscillations and ripples that run all the way through this curve. Those are the shadows of previous small plagues, let's call them, and propagating through time. And then the whole thing smooths out around 1940. Penicillin, vaccines, and the modern era of medicine. And notice how smooth the curve is. And notice, guys, that we haven't been doing well in the second half of the 20th century. The women are living longer than we are, or at least maybe it just seems longer. But in any case, it is longer. And you can count now, I think, on this kind of steady increase, but the goal of Genescient is to do better than that. And if you're worried about the singularity, there's what I call the gap problem. I looked up this photograph. You know, the problem is getting there, right? You can argue about when it's going to arrive, but if you're not there, you're really not going to care. So if you really want to get ahead, you have to use what we call the genomic flashlight. What's really happened in a pronounced way in the last decade is that the formerly dark areas of what causes longevity and how come there's no miracle thing that will make you all live longer and how come nobody's lived notably beyond 122 means you got to look at the genomics. And here, when you turn on the flashlight, you see, to a great extent, a lot of bad news, because here's how most people think about biology. Nice, simple processes. This is a known process. Not my field, so I just show you the diagram. But most of the interesting traits are not simply given by linear diagrams. They look like this. They're very complicated, and we're just now trying to figure them out. Because evolution, you see, doesn't have to be simple. In fact, it seems to prefer not to be. There are always trade-offs in the entire genome between various things that affect longevity and survival. So, in fact, these networks are huge. And they're information-rich. And maybe the biggest idea to emerge in biology by direct study in the last decade has been that this is an information technology business. It's a science now dominated by the ability to process information and understand its implications physiologically and throughout the whole life of the organisms. So how do you turn on the lights in this vast array? And the answer is you go back to Charlie Darwin. That is, Genesian is based on a series of experiments carried out over the last 33 years in which Michael Rose, who's sitting right here in the audience, simply didn't let fruit flies, Drosophila, reproduce, took away the eggs, until half were dead. And you do it for hundreds and hundreds of generations. That means you are selecting for longevity, and as you move the reproduction age further to the right, you stop this bad information, bad genomic signaling that are coming down and are causing aging and death. That's the trick. The trick is to do it through most of your adult lifespan, and that's what Michael Rose has done, and that's why I and a co-investor, Christina Riza, 4 years ago, bought his flies. Just move in, spend the money. I'd made a bunch of money writing novels, I might as well do something with it. And my guide in this was Robert A. Heinlein, whom I knew for several decades, and his great novel, Methuselah's Children, which emphasized human selection. He imagined that people had been doing it for centuries, and therefore we got long-lived humans out of it. Well, what the flies have told us is that's a great idea, but it would take about 17,000 years. And again, the gap problem. So this is what Michael did. And he has pursued that, and Genesian has turned it into a marketable commodity incidentally, we're still accelerating the Methuselah flies, we call them. The flies themselves, the ordinary Methuselahs, live 4.5 times longer than the ordinary flies because of hundreds of generations of selection. We now have super Methuselahs. We wait until 75% are dead, that we've accelerated another 20% in lifetime in the last 3 years. So this is what the survival curve of the normal female flies looks like versus the long-lived flies, the Methuselahs. And so you can see you're pushing that curve out to the right. And the good news is that unlike a novel by Aldous Huxley, After Many a Summer Dies the Swan, old age does not mean frailty. The Methuselah flies have more sex, lay more eggs, and physically do better than the control flies. They're having sex when the control flies have been dead for several generations. So, if that's of interest to you, here's what we did. We did genome-wide screens with the Methuselah flies to find the core genes associated with the longevity in the Methuselahs versus the controls. We found about 1,000. We then, of course, this was all based on gene expression analysis done about 4 years ago. As soon as we got the flies, we did it. Bam, just like that. In fact, we used my home for the laboratory for the summer. Then we screened for the matching genomics in humans. We used the Wellcome Trust data, as a matter of fact, 16,000 patients. And we got out of that 150 genomic changes that match with longevity in humans. And we classified them in disease groups. Cardio, diabetes. After all, what do flies do for a living? They eat sugar and fly around. So they die of diabetes, cardio problems, neurological problems. We found new genes we know to be associated with Huntington's, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. And we're pursuing that program too. Well, what these flies have done, the Methuselahs, is edit out the bad signals. And those are the genes we now want to retune. Now, all this is essentially diagnostic. But frankly, I didn't get into this to build a better diagnostic. How many people would go to the hospital if it was only had diagnosticians in it? So we did this. We look at the information signal that's translated from the fruit flies, the Methuselahs, into the genomic differences. We go to the genomic information bases in humans, we pull out the homologs, it's called. It means same gene does the same thing. So the deep question is, why should we care about flies? Who wants flies to live longer? Is that the flies are we're using artificial selection to pull information out of the flies and find out what the genes do in flies that also do the same thing in humans. And they make, say, the heartbeat and the sugar process. So, and we look at genome-wide association studies, and we mined a bunch of these, again, an information problem, to find out exactly what we're talking about and what disorders we can treat. This first product, whoops, which I just dropped, is based toward cardio problems, because that's the biggest problem that kills most people. So, step 3 is that we use selection as a supercomputer. That's the way to think about it. It has gone in through hundreds of generations of flies and pulled the information out that you can't get with statistical studies. You have to do the lab work. And that tells us what the bad signals are. But again, we're looking for something to fix this problem. And so we pursued 2 things: pharmaceuticals and nutrigenomic agents. Nutrigenomic means a nutrient, classified by our friends at the FDA, which is derived from genomic information. That's what the term means. Now, how do you get all the way to pharmaceuticals? Well, we are using the information that we have mined to better inform those who are interested in pharmaceuticals about what they should be pursuing. For example, there are some simple gene correspondences like OPA1, which causes blindness and heart disease. And you certainly want to edit that out and deal with it. And you can also do things to flies. You can get flies that have been forced to be afflicted by certain disorders, such as heart attacks. We've learned how to give heart attacks to flies in order to find out what is operating. They don't like it, but they're just flies. They undergo defib, for example. So what Michael Rose has done is he's basically opened the box and revealed the genomic underpinnings, which are very complicated. And we've just started to analyze it. It's an IT problem. And so we work backward from the genomics to find out what pathways we should upregulate, that is, upregulate the genes that will give your body's defenses against cardio and other problems. And then we test those substances on control flies and see if we can extend the fly lifetime. Those that pass the test, we investigate further. We do this. We don't just want more longevity. You can do that by eating less. It doesn't appeal to me, and probably doesn't appeal to most people. But the problem with eating less is it also reduces your function, a subject not much talked about. Ask the next calorie restriction person, what do they do for kicks? Actually, except for think about food. And often you'll find they don't do a lot for kicks. So we look at the mating function of the flies that have their lifetimes extended by male mating success, of interest to some of us, and heart function by pacing test, also, by the way, the number of eggs that the females lay. We look at all that, and also resistance to infection. Turns out that all those are powerfully correlated. So what I think we've done is, first, we've showed that the rate of aging is a very complex problem. Now, we weren't the first people to think about this, but the point is we found out in detail. To some extent, the rate of aging is inherited. Interestingly enough, it's not strongly inherited in identical twins. One of the reasons I'm interested in this is that I am an identical twin. The closest form of identical twin beyond us lie the Siamese twins. But in fact, aging correlates somewhat among identicals, but not strongly, because it's a very complex trait and it depends on outside influences. It depends on some extent on where you live. So, we found the orthologs of the aging-associated genes in the Methuselahs, and they strongly correlate with our disease categories, because largely flies die of the same things we do. They don't have original death modes. And then we use these orthologs as a screen to find the substances like this one, which work in animal models, in both flies and mice. Everybody seems to think mice are a great model, and they are a good model, but mostly mice die of cancer. Our biggest killer is cardio. So, and now we move beyond this, we're using more advanced sequencing and analytical tools, and our objective is to identify the portfolio of aging-associated genes that are common in flies, mice, and humans. You've got to start somewhere. You've got to start in a simple animal model. And so the whole point of Genescient is that we hope to use IT to make this the century most strongly led by biology. Last century was physics. That's to some extent why I became a physicist. We use selection and genomics. That's the point. This is the first major corporation based on artificial selection of traits. And of course, it's using resources developed over decades. And therefore, we want to give ourselves the health revolution that is going to be necessary if you want to get to singularity, because you can't be sure when it's going to come, but you do know that you ought to be prepared to wait. And these are the people that we have collaborated with and formed alliances with in this effort. It's not just our effort. We're working with all the major people who are interested in this field. So that's the prospect. This product we will field next year, and also several others. This is just the one that I, by the way, have been taking for about half a year, and I can report that it does, in fact, have a perceptible effect. It tends to give you more energy, but it's not actually a stimulant. It appears to be associated with some repair mechanisms that we believe we understand, at least qualitatively. So that's the general story, and now, because we've got Michael Rose in the audience, if you have some questions, technical questions for a biologist, I'm not a biologist, then Michael can answer them. Thank you. Well, we're going to probably, that's a good question actually, we're exploring having a low-cost program in which people will take these and report back what they feel are effects or some simple measurements that they can make, to make this, in a sense, an IT community interaction. I mean, it's the previous panel about participatory science. Well, I think biology and health is a great place for participatory science. You can take part, get a good effect, we hope, but report back in. And that, I think, is one of the key ideas of this century that we've got to exploit more.
That actually was my question indeed, if I can jump in, because I wanted to see exactly how we can participate as volunteers. I think I've already signed up on your website as a taker of your products.
Thank you. Yes, right. That's exactly the list we're going to use. Right. You'll be hearing from us.
Can you describe how you're going to market this, given that the FDA does not recognize aging as a disease? This is the problem Sertrus ran into. Yep. And can you talk a little bit about how this relates to what they're doing with caloric restriction and the sirtuins that they're researching?
Actually, you know, the guy to answer that is sitting right there. Michael, you want to come forward and answer it? Michael Rose.
Hi. So Sertrus and resveratrol for us are very exciting as pioneering efforts to penetrate into this sector. And it's done very important work in giving people the idea that maybe there's something they can do about their health. And you brought up the FDA. And the FDA and the medical system is primarily about curing disease. And when you're curing disease, you're saying there's a bunch of healthy people, then there's this other set of people who have some specific disorder, and doctors cure those specific disorders, and that's what the FDA regulates in regulating the use and approval of pharmaceuticals. So what Genescient is based on, in part, is actually enhancing your health, same concept as resveratrol and Sertrus. Genescient, however, hopes also to contribute to the development of pharmaceuticals, for which it will do the normal FDA things. But Sertrus is based on effectively one major pathway, and which resveratrol is intended to target. Genescient is a 21st century genomics company, not a late 20th century biotech company. That means that in the world of Genescient, in the world that Greg Benford has presented to you, we are about hundreds of pathways, because we now know it takes the retuning of hundreds of pathways to radically enhance health and to produce doubling and quadrupling of lifespan. So that means that Genescient's program is a cumulative or additive one where we hope to layer what we call nutrigenomic agents, one on top of another, based on the genomic research, based on repeated levels of screening in fruit flies, people, and even mice, to cumulatively enhance health step by step. And my model for how this would happen is somewhat like the automotive industry, which started from a single-stroke internal combustion engine in the late 19th century and steadily improved by many, many small steps over the years to now. And it's still improving because hopefully we'll have plug-in, if not fully electric, then at least plug-in hybrid cars, which I think we're hearing about shortly. Essentially, we want to take your body from like being a 1920s clunker to being a very up-to-date, highly robust
But will you need FDA
product.
approval to do this? That's what Surtrus is doing right now. They need to go through FDA approval.
Yeah. Well,
diabetes.
very, very salient question. So Surtrus is actually pursuing the same two tracks that Genesiant will pursue, one part of which is a nutritional supplement, which is resveratrol, and another part of which is pharmaceutical targeting. Now, when you do pharmaceutical targeting, you want a massive, strong hit at a small number of focal pathways that are gone badly wrong in people with acute disease. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the truth is, most everybody in this room is going to hell in a handbasket, not primarily from one or two acute diseases, but because everything is getting worse. Okay? And that is what we want to stop. We want to stop everything getting bad. That's what we're targeting.
Hi. Hello. So my question is, on the first slide you showed by 2100 we're going to increase the curve of the of lifespan. Is there a fundamental limit to how much we can improve that curve as time goes on? And why can't you improve it indefinitely?
You know, the nice thing about being chairman of the board, all you have to do is point to the chief scientist.
Well, thank you for that question. That's what we've been working on for the last 15 years in my lab at University of California, Irvine. There are, in fact, no limits to the increase in lifespan. And what Genesiant hopes to start is a wave of endless improvement in the human lifespan. There is no resistance by evolution or biology to the improvement of lifespan, contrary to what people have assumed for millennia, that we can, in fact, start a wave. This is sort of like, to us, a biological singularity event. I mean, as far as we're concerned, that's happening right now, a singularity event by which we hope to autocatalytically and explosively give rise to a wave of increased survival, which will steadily increase onward and onward and onward, so that as each century goes by, people will live longer by more than a century. And it will just go on. And Aubrey de Grey is very beautiful the way he presents this as the escape velocity concept.
Yeah.
That's exactly what Genesiant is about, is getting us so that we just go wham, so that people who are alive today, so maybe some of you in this room will live to 150 or 200, like you. You look really young to me.
Right.
You could be one of those people.
Right. Yeah, we can only do one more question. Say over here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Yeah. There's been a lot of talk in the conference about how smart nature is and DNA, and I was just curious, since a lot of the worries that we have right now, you see in the paper a lot, is how we can't get existing pharmaceuticals out of the water. If there's been any interest in looking at the things that nature has to offer in itself, there are some cultures that, like the Tibetans and India.
That's what our nutrigenomic agenda is about. We use natural substances. That's why the FDA doesn't get in the way, by the way. We're practically nature boy. But the point is, we intelligently target the genomic pathways we know. It's not just try a bunch of stuff, but rather target the pathways. That's what's new about this. So that's exactly the game plan that we have, and that's what we're carrying forward. It'll take a decade to get a big pharma product out, but we're going to have this guy on the street in a few months. And I think there are good chances that these kinds of substances can do a lot more good now instead of waiting for pie in the sky when you're about ready to die. Well, thank you.